A lexicographer's view of grammar begins with the parts of speech, 8 tidy categories we shunt words into based on their function within a sentence. If you survived the American educational system, you can probably rattle off at least 4 parts of speech: noun, verb, adjective, adverb. And here the nerds among us chime in with the remainder: conjunction, interjection, pronoun, and preposition. Most people think of the parts of speech as discrete categories, drawers with their own identifying labels. And when you peek inside, there's the English language, neatly folded like a retiree's socks. Noun, person, place, or thing. Verb describes action. Adjective modifies nouns. Adverb answers the W questions. Conjunction joins words together. Interjection, things we say when we are happy, surprised, or pissed off. Your first disconcerting realization as a lexicographer is that you're the person who's responsible for sifting the language and placing individual words in those drawers. This is a sharp whack against your naive assumptions about how words come into being and exist. You mean words don't just appear ex nihilo in the drawer they're supposed to be in? You mean some slob in a beige office in Massachusetts is the one who decides what a word is? Not quite. Your job as a lexicographer, and part of the reason why Gil is looking doubtfully in your general direction this afternoon, is to learn how to carefully parse English as it is used, sentence by sentence, and correctly classify the words within that sentence by their function. You don't decide what part of speech a word is. The general speaking, writing public does. You merely discern what its part of speech is and then accurately report it in the dictionary entry. This should be a comfort, but it is not. English is a remarkably flexible language, and its grammar is not nearly as tidy as we've been led to believe. Those parts of speech are not discrete boxes keeping everything dust-free and separate, but more like a jumble of fishing nets. Randolph Quirk, lead author of A Comprehensive Grammar of the English Language, calls this gradients. Many words are caught easily in those individual nets. In the sentence, "Dictionaries are great," we can tell that dictionaries is a noun because it fits into the common oversimplified paradigm we're all taught to identify nouns: person, place, or thing. There are, however, plenty of words that live on the periphery of a part of speech, and they can get tangled between those fishing nets. Nouns can act like adjectives: chocolate cake. Adjectives can act like nouns. Grammarians are the damned. Verbs can look like verbs: she's running down the street, or adjectives: a running engine, or nouns: her favorite hobby is running. Adverbs look like everything. They are the junk drawer of the English language. Even within one net, the catch is still eel slick. A lexicographer can look at the sentence, "The young editors were bent to Webster's will," and after some mental finagling, decide that bent is actually a verb here, the past tense of bend. Very good. Now, is this use of bend transitive? That is, does it require an object, as in I bend steel? Or is it intransitive? That is, it doesn't require an object, as in reeds bend. Were bent could be a passive use of bend, where the force doing the bending is hidden from lexical view, and transitive verbs are generally used in passive constructions. But who is the actor here? Webster's disembodied will? Older editors who are not going to take any young upstart bullshit? It's all muddling together in your mind. You put the end of your pencil in your mouth to keep yourself from muttering in exasperation, and wonder if you're nonetheless wrong, that bent is actually the adjective we formed from the past participle of bend. This is the adjective that appears in Go to Hell and Get Bent. You have pulled your notepad toward you and are scrawling all sorts of unintentionally creepy sentences on it using synonyms. The young editors were subdued. Someone subdued the young editors, trying to figure out whether this use is transitive or not. And the more you write, the less you know. You're not alone. Peter Sokolowski of Merriam-Webster now keeps a rare editorial artifact passed down from editor to editor, the transitivity tester. The transitizer, as some of us call it, is a pink index card with a sentence on it and a hole cut out where the verb of the sentence is, so you can lay the card over your problem verb and read the resulting sentence to see if that verb is in fact transitive. The transitizer reads, "I'm a blank ya ass. I'm a bend ya ass to Webster's will." There you go. This sense of bend must be transitive. If lexicographers and linguists had their way, English would have 28 parts of speech, though enough that we could shoehorn most of these grammatical outliers into some tidier containers. Linguists have proposed even more complicated systems, and they tend to use them within their publications. But there's enough grammatical variation in English that it's unlikely that even 28 parts of speech would be enough. Hell, there are roughly a dozen different types of pronouns in English alone. Us harmless drudges can talk fluently about them because that sort of esoteric knowledge is always the province of the eccentric. But I'm unconvinced that the vast majority of English readers and speakers need to know the difference between them or would care if they did. Even lexicographers can only delve so deep. A few years after my training, I was proofreading in the letter T and saw that we listed the as an adjective. I thought it might be a mistake, so I checked the entry in our unabridged dictionary, Webster's Third. Adjective. Setting aside the proofs, I saw Gil leave his office and cornered him at the coffee maker to ask about it. I knew our options for parts of speech were limited, I explained, but adjective seems a little random. Not entirely random, he said. The did modify nouns, like adjectives, and we had tradition on our side in case of complaints. The had been entered in dictionaries as an adjective since the 19th century. But, I said, it seemed like an imperfect fix. The point is to accurately describe how a word is used, and that includes its part of speech. If we can't get that right, Gil sighed. He had just come out of his office for coffee, and now someone who thought they were Webster's gift to grammar was accosting him about the English articles. He harumphed, "Well, given that your options are limited, where else are you going to put the damn things?" Lexicographers and linguists claim to be peeveless. We are, after all, objective scholars of language, but that is disingenuous. Emily Brewster, who's a colleague of mine, confesses to caring about the distinction between lay and lie. And even after all these years, stumbling across impactful in prose makes me blanch, and this is after I have had to goddamn define impactful. But there's one peeve, one particular and incredibly minor complaint that lexicographers and linguists indulge in with all the zeal of a convert defending the one true faith, and that is that everyone but them uses the word grammar wrong. To linguists and lexicographers, the word grammar has generally referred to the way that words interact with each other in a sentence, or the systematic rules that govern the way those words interact. Grammar, to the lexicographer, tells us why we say, "he and I went to the store," and not "him and I went to the store," or why we stick the verb between the subject and the object, usually, and not at the end like German does, as in, why we the verb between the subject and the object stick, which is perfectly grammatical and normal in German. Lexicographers are pretty decent with this sort of grammar, which is ostensibly objective and factual. But when people who aren't linguists and lexicographers talk about grammar, that's not what they mean. They're not talking about the systematic rules that govern where the verb goes in a standard English sentence. They're talking about a much broader view of language. To them, grammar is a loose conglomeration of stylistic word choices that get codified into right and wrong, misspellings that every English speaker has made at some point in their life and yet are branded as bad grammar, half-remembered rules about usage shamed into them by their middle school English teachers, and personal, sometimes irrational dislikes. This is the grammar that shows up on internet memes about your and your, the sort of grammar that people are referring to when they claim you can't end a sentence with a preposition, the grammar that is invoked when people complain that the 10 items or less sign at the grocery store is bad grammar. This sort of grammar is likely something that you value very highly because it takes work to master, and you've likely devoted a measurable chunk of your waking hours to mastering it, as have we all. Think of this sort of grammar like building blocks. The earliest stuff we learn is laid unconsciously and underground. When there's more than one of a noun, we generally mark that by adding an S to the end of the word. Verbs go in the middle of a sentence between a subject and an object. Verbs can change their form when they refer to different speakers, and so on. This becomes the foundation that we all start with. As we go through life, and particularly through school, we collect more blocks to stack on our foundation. Don't end sentences with prepositions. Don't use the passive voice. Use were for was in conditional clauses, though not always, and the exceptions are more blocks to collect later. The blocks become smaller, able to be wedged into any noticeable gaps in our walls. Lay is used with a stated object, like lay the book on the table, and lie is used without a stated object. I'm going to lie down on the sofa. Who is only used in reference to people, and that only in reference to things. Definitely do not ever, under any circumstances, use ain't. We scrabble at these and mortar them into place, building our towers higher and higher, and always comparing ourselves with people who have found fewer bricks, or who have built their towers sloppily. It's all reckoned as grammar to us, by which we inevitably mean good grammar, and by which we measure ourselves against others. This is also the sort of grammar that young lexicographers are steeped in. So when Steve Peralt, our director of defining, asks if we have, quote, a good grasp of English grammar in the interview, we puff and preen a little bit. Of course, we say, we have a great grasp of grammar. We have spent an entire life fortifying this tower with as many bricks as we could find. Just a second. Alas for us. One of the first things every lexicographer must do in their style and defining class is face their own linguistic prejudices and be willing to suspend or revise them in light of evidence to the contrary. For me, this came down to the word good. In one of our early style and defining classes, Gil bellowed the word at us. Adjective or adverb, he asked. There was a pause. Everyone knows the answer to this. I thought, is this a trick question? And I stepped into the breach. It's an adjective, I said, memories of some language arts teacher from years past barking, well, at me every time I said, I don't feel good. You feel well, because well is an adverb. You don't feel good, despite what James Brown proclaims, because good is an adjective. Gil asked, what about I'm doing good? Isn't that adverbial? I felt not so good. That was adverbial. But, I reasoned, you're not supposed to say that. You should say I'm doing well. He smacked his lips. And do you say I'm doing well? Or do you say I'm doing good? He looked pointedly at me. We both knew that I had, just 5 minutes earlier, answered his question about how I was doing with the grammar practice with, I'm doing good. I was fairly certain he was about to fire me, or perhaps unhinge his jaw and swallow me whole. And so I tried my level best to melt into the floor. He ignored my discomfort. Good, he went on, has been used for almost 1,000 years as an adverb, even though usage commentators and peevers have condemned this use. Dictionaries, he explained, were records of the language as it is used, and so we must set aside our disdain for the adverb good, and here he looked over his glasses at me, and record its long use in our dictionaries in spite of the rather pointless foofara around its existence. Then Gil sat back and smiled broadly, and my tower, bricks began falling all over the goddamn place. Gil made his speech in part because the whole notion that dictionaries merely record language as people use it grates against what we generally think dictionaries do. Many people, And many people who think they'd be good at this lexicography gig believe that the dictionary is some great guardian of the English language, that its job is to set boundaries of decorum around this profligate language, like a great linguistic house mother setting curfew. Words that have made it into the dictionary are official, with a capital O, sanctioned, part of real and proper English. The corollary is that if certain words are bad, uncouth, unlovely, or distasteful, then folks think that the dictionary will make sure they are never entered into official, proper English. The language is thus protected, kept right, pure, good. This is commonly called prescriptivism, and it is unfortunately not how dictionaries work at all. We don't just enter the good stuff. We enter the bad and the ugly stuff too. We are just observers, and the goal is to describe as accurately as possible as much of the language as we can. This approach is descriptivism, and it is the philosophical basis for almost all modern dictionaries. All a word needs to merit entry into most professionally written dictionaries is widespread and sustained use in written English prose. You'd be surprised how many bad and unlovely words make it into written English prose on a consistent basis. I'm throwing a lot of scare quotes around, but I throw them around advisedly. Uses that fall outside what we think of as standard English are given a moral charge. Well-meaning parents tell kids that ain't is bad English. People sneer at those who use irregardless. We've each survived that one high school teacher who has, throughout your paper, circled every preposition that appears at the end of a sentence and commented at the top of your essay, an A+ idea corrupted by C- grammar. I had that teacher, and that comment still chaps my hide. There are tons, literal imperial tons of books about improving yourself through better grammar. Books with titles like When Bad Grammar Happens to Good People. And The Honest to a Fault, I Judge You When You Use Poor Grammar. And note the use of poor here instead of the slightly more informal but much more common bad. The idea that poor marks quality, whereas bad marks morality, is truly a peeve beyond all other peeves. A real peever's peeve. Well done. This attitude goes to extremes. An acquaintance recently shared with me his belief that when words gain new meanings, it is not just linguistic and educational degradation, but an active work of evil with a capital E in our world. Prescriptivism and descriptivism have been shoehorned into this moral dualism as well. The former purportedly champions the best practices of English and eschews the newfangled linguistic relativism of descriptivism. And here I must note that modern linguistic relativism goes back to at least 2,000 years. Horace, in his Ars Poetica, says, "Many words shall revive which now have fallen off, and many which are now in esteem shall fall off, if it be the will of usage, in whose power is the decision and right and standard of language." What a commie hippie liberal. If that's descriptivism, prescriptivism then must be good, because how can the best practices of English be anything but good? And if prescriptivism is good, then descriptivism, its principles, and its practitioners must perforce be bad. In a letter to his publisher, E.B. White, the second half of the famous Strunk & White, responsible for the best-selling writing guide, The Elements of Style, beautifully expresses the modern complaint against descriptivism. Quote, "I've been sympathetic all along with your qualms about the elements of style, but I know that I cannot, and shall not, attempt to adjust the unadjustable Mr. Strunk to the modern liberal of the English department, the anything-goes fellow. Your letter expresses contempt for this fellow, but on the other hand, you seem to want his vote. I am against him temperamentally, and because I have seen the work of his disciples, and I say the hell with him." Descriptivists, those anything-goes hippies, we've seen their work, and every right-thinking person everywhere says to hell with them. Now, as a lexicographer, you are one. That's it. Thank you.
At what point does the sheer level of I don't know what to say without sounding like without a prescriptivist. Does the sheer level of error so completely swamp the original meanings of words or phrases that at some point the point of the dictionary is to say, hey guys, we see where you're all going with this new sense of the word, but hey, you might want to just check to see that it doesn't actually tally in any simple way with the plain or the root meaning of the words.
Right. So at what point does the dictionary cave and make everything wrong? So when things are clearly in error, like the sculptures will memorize you, though who knows? I mean, we're living in a brave new world. Maybe the sculptures do memorize you. So that would have to be widespread. So it would have to appear on more than just one radio show, and it would have to be used in print and in broadcast of all stripes. So, you know, you would have to have Vibe magazine use Memorize, and then you'd have to have the Wall Street Journal use Memorize, and you'd want it to be ideally sort of a broad geographical stretch. So if it shows up in South Africa, and then it shows up in Canada, and it shows up in America, and it's around for a while, then it is eligible for entry. Now, I will say that things that are clearly misspellings, like the misspelling of achieve, which I can't actually say aloud because I can't spell aloud and I actually no longer remember how to spell achieve correctly. This is an occupational hazard of looking at words all day. So that shows up all the time, but it's clearly a typo. It's not a variant spelling. So I can't say that these things won't make their way into a dictionary, but we'll probably all be dead by the time they do. That's what I'm thinking.
There are some words which drive some people crazy.
Well, amen to that.
Hopefully drove, I believe, Bill Sapphire crazy.
Oh yeah, he hated that word.
I am driven crazy by like. I'm hearing the word like until I'm about to blow my head. What words drive you crazy?
What words drive me crazy? That's an excellent question. I hate with this visceral, every fiber of my being, the word impactful, which I reference in here. I find it. Now, you don't have to clap, because lots of smart people have used impactful. I just really think it's ugly and horrible and should be shot to the moon in a spaceship. So I hate the word impactful. That's really one that just kind of, I really dislike the word pleasure or bleisure. I still don't know how to say it. It is a blend of the words business and leisure. So you take a pleasure trip, and it sounds like a medical procedure or like a medical symptom. You know, the patient had edema and pleasure, and so that's one of those words I don't like the sound of it. I mean, it's a handy word, right? Like, it's like biz cash. It's kind of that, but I don't like saying pleasure. I can feel like, it's just the way it makes my mouth move, like, pleasure. So I dislike pleasure or bleisure and impactful. Some words that I really used to hate, I've actually come to have a grudging respect for. If you have read the book, you know I have come to have a grudging respect for irregardless. Though, I know everyone's going to get up and leave. We're done! It's not a word I use. It's a word that I grew up being told this is illiterate and you shouldn't use it. But I had to do a lot of research for it for work. And I have come to really respect that this word it's been around since the late 1700s. And it's this word that has just hung on the periphery of the language and just won't go away, even though I have never met a person who likes the word irregardless. I've never met a person who will own up to saying the word irregardless or using the word irregardless, though I have printed evidence of a bunch of you people using irregardless. So I think as you do this job more, you have to let go of, I mean, I will never like impactful and I will never like bleisure, and that's how it is. I actually have had to revise the entry for impactful, which meant I spent 2 days reading citations for impactful, and each day I went home and like needed a jaw massage because I'd been clenching my teeth the whole time. But if you do this job, you have to, you either have to come to see the beauty or the interesting things about language and particular words that irritate you, or you really will literally go insane. We've had editors who have just said, I can't do this, I'm going to lose my mind. And they leave after a year or two.
Hi, Kory. So I've been trying to figure out how to get my own words into the dictionary.
Yes.
The one I like actually relates to what you just said, irregardful.
Ooh. No, okay, so
that makes some sense.
irregardful would mean with...
It would mean exactly the same as regardless.
Okay,
But,
with
you know,
regard
just,
to, yeah, okay.
if you need that extra syllable at the beginning, then you have it, and it's available to you. So.
Oh, I like that.
Okay, so, but I try to get that into widespread and sustained use in printed materials everywhere, and that doesn't really seem to be working that well for me. So I guess my question is, how many people at Merriam-Webster would I have to contribute to their children's college fund to get this sort of slipped into the dictionary? And, you know, how's that happen? What's the standard fee?
Well, you know, lexicographers are notoriously hard to bribe because you have to, first, you have to actually speak to them. And lexicographers hate being spoken to. And in order to efficiently bribe someone, you not only have to speak to them, but you kind of have to give off these like, visual cues and body language, and in sort of the, you know, you would say like, so, I've got a couple $100 with your name on it. And lexicographers don't read social cues at all. They would stand there and go, because we don't want anyone talking to us and we don't read social cues. So you would have to somehow do this in writing without, you know, use an internet anonymizer maybe, or, yeah, I think that's the only way you're going to have to do it. I mean, there are a lot of people who want, I mean, most of the email I get at work, because I get emailed, this is part of my job, I have to answer correspondence, which I get to do it because I'm good at dealing with angry people. So, and a lot of people write in and say, I want my word in the dictionary, and you give them the regular spiel. And then, which is, the word needs widespread use, it needs sustained use for a number of years, and it needs to have a meaning. So, you know, irregardful has a meaning. Great. I've had some people say things like, enter my word, joshiosity, into the dictionary. It can mean whatever you want. I was like, it doesn't work so well. So once a word has those things, and then it's eligible for entry. But a lot of people assume that this is a really quick process, because language creation is a quick process, right? Like, you can come up with a word like that, and you can get all of your friends to use it really easily. And you might even be able to get it into a letter. No, not your friends. Your friends know better. You might even be able to get it into print, right? Like, you might write it in a letter to the editor. This is the gold standard for getting things in print, right? Anyone will print anything in a letter to the editor. And you know, people assume that it needs one or two instances, and then we're okay. And it needs dozens and dozens and dozens over a really long stretch of time. I mean, I wasn't joking that much when I said these words will be entered into the dictionary long after all of us in this room are dead, because that's kind of how long it takes for a lot of words to get in. So I'm sorry, lexicographers are not very good at reading social cues, so this is going to be really hard to bribe us. All right.
I was wondering about common words. You were great, by the way. Very. This has been terrific. Common words like, excuse me for the like, green,
Okay.
left, right. Words that we all know what they mean, but if I had to write a meaning for left or get words to describe green, that would be tough. So which kinds of words do you find the most challenging to define?
I think the words that are hardest to find, that's an excellent question, are the smallest words. So any word like as, like, is one, but, those are hard to do. Common words, I actually had to define the word general for one of our children's dictionaries, and that was really difficult to define because it's a very abstract adjective, and general, the noun, was easy. That was like, military thing, very simple. But general, the adjective gets used, it has all these shades of meaning, and they're not really separated from each other. So you kind of have to make these artificial distinctions and sort of go, that's that. I think the two hardest entries I have ever had to define, one is take. I did take for the 11th collegiate. That took me a month. And it had, this was when we were still using paper. Now everything's digital, but we had index cards. And I had piles of index cards on literally every surface I could have an index card. I had index cards in my keyboard, like between the rows of keys and on the top of my cubicle wall. And that's difficult because how do you describe take the witness stand? How do you do that? What kind of words do you use? Okay, when someone takes the witness stand, they step into the witness stand. Well, you can't use witness stand, okay. And that's not quite what it means. It can be a physical thing, but it can also be sort of a figurative thing. If someone takes the witness stand and testifies, that means that they are called into a court to give testimony, okay. So it's really difficult. Those really common words are super difficult. Take was really hard. I revised the entry for God for our unabridged dictionary, and that took me 4 months. And I'm sure that I am going to go to some nasty afterlife destination because every sense of it, first, I'm only dealing with uses of the word God, but it's really hard to distinguish between the thing and the word for a lot of people. So if people look up the word chair, they expect you to describe the thing, not how the word chair is used. So with God, that was one of those, and it was for the unabridged dictionary, and it was all online, so I had no space constraints. Space constraints are the lexicographer's friend, because you get used to saying, well, I just don't have room, sorry. And that one took me 4 months because you have to agonize over every single word. Can I use immutable here? Can I use omnipotent here? Do I say this use of God in the neo-pagan sense do I say that's a deity or a being or a person? Like what word do I use there? So the smaller the words get, the less complicated the words get, the harder they are to define. And I also had to copy edit do and go for our learner's dictionary. Learner's dictionary is for people who are learning English as a foreign language. And you don't realize how much you use do and go until you actually have to sit down and catalog all of the ways that you use do and go. So the smaller the word, the harder it is to define.
So I was proofreading something at the office, and it was a noun, apostrophe S, and was used as a contraction, not possessive.
Okay.
So I'm wondering am I just behind the times that I don't recognize this as common usage, or was it an incorrect use of apostrophe S?
So like dogs running, like the dog's running, the dog apostrophe S running, dog is running.
Yeah, it was an inanimate object. I can't remember the noun.
Okay.
But it was, I'm writing documentation of processes. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Somebody's got to do it. And I came across this, and it was written by a millennial. And
oh, half the room went, ha, and the other half of the room went, ooh.
And I said, am I just behind? It didn't look right to me. So am I just behind in knowing what's common usage, or can apostrophe S be used as a contraction with a noun?
Generally, it's not. We now use apostrophe S generally when it's attached to nouns as possessive, unless it is a pronoun. So, Wasn't a pronoun, okay. So here's the thing. Lots of people fetch about apostrophe. Well, two things. If you're an editor, then your job is to make things not stand out, right? Your job is to make something, especially if you're doing processes, there's no narrative interest, there's no reason for anyone to get excited about this. We're just going to make it, smooth it all out. So if I were editing, I would change that. Broadly, the way that we use apostrophes has changed dramatically since the 17th century. It used to be that apostrophe S was the way that you made plurals, possessives, and contractions. And that started to change in about the late 1700s, early 1800s. You can still see it in some of Jane Austen's stuff if you find like early editions that are faithful to the way that her punctuation works. So this is the thing, right? We assume that the way that the language is now is the way the language has always been, and that's not always the case. And you often hear people fetch about apostrophes because people say, it's so simple, guys, it's so simple. But it's not always so simple. How do I pluralize, or how do I make possessive the name Jesus or the name Moses? You generally don't add an apostrophe S, you add an apostrophe, and that's it. Okay, but Jones, you can add an apostrophe S to that. So why is Jesus just the apostrophe and Jones is the apostrophe S? So there's not actually as much consistency in these things as we think. So I tend to, when I edit, I put on my Peaver hat because that's my job when I edit, and I tend to do things like, I will query it to the author and say, did you mean the dog is running? This looks like a possessive to me, as opposed to just saying, wrong, you know, even though that's what we all want to do, right? Anytime you get to correct anyone's grammar or usage, it's like, you know, like, I got this. I know how apostrophes work, and you don't, so I'm smarter than you. So yeah, apostrophes are tricky. I mean, they haven't been consistent. They've just really only in the last 100 years gained any kind of consistency in use.
Given your experience and learning, what do you think the prevalence of social media and the internet mean to the universality or a greater universality of meaning and what you do as a lexicographer? Is it just going to make everything fractured, or is it going to make everything come together more?
Oh, that's an excellent question, and one I can't really answer. The thing that we know about English is English never goes where you want it to go. I say in the book, I have an analogy that I say English is like a child. You nurture and love it into being, and once it gains gross motor skills, it goes right for the goddamn electrical sockets. Like it goes right where you don't want it to go. I will say this, the internet and particularly social media have done two things for lexicographers. The first is the internet has given us access to more stuff, which is great because you get to see different types of English. You know, really, lexicographers work mostly in the written word, and the written word is, for the most part, kind of this, like the register of it is pretty narrow. And so now the internet gives us access to more types of English, which is super exciting and completely overwhelming because there's like 50 of us, right? Like there's 50 of us in the nation. So you spend all day reading the internet. Like it's just like, ugh. So it gives us access to more, which is great. The other thing that I find fascinating about social media in particular is that, so we know lexicographers work mostly from writing. And we know that most people speak differently than the way they write. I certainly speak differently than I write. Because when we write, it has permanence. We tend to be a little bit more formal. We've all been trained that, you know, you want people to think you have good grammar because you don't want people to think you're an idiot. So you write you write according to the book. And you speak according to how you are comfortable speaking. The internet and social media exists in this weird in-between place. It's written down, but its register is very spoken. So you see a lot more spoken slang quicker. And especially this is very apparent in African American vernacular English slang. So things like lit and woke, you know, those suddenly everybody, I mean, I think I saw the New York Review of Books use lit in a tweet, like the New York Review of Books just called this lit. Like, oh, that's like, okay. So the thing is that it exposes you to more, and social media exposes us to more, sort of more informal language, but it also makes it spread a lot faster. I give an example in the book about On Fleek. Does anyone here remember On Fleek? Now, On Fleek's day is done. The sun has set on that. But in our first instance of On Fleek, is from a June 2014 Vine video. That's how long ago it was. Vine was still a thing. By a 15 or 16-year-old girl named Peaches Monroe, who says, "Finna get crunk, eyebrows on fleek, roll out bitches." And finna get crunk means we're getting ready to get wild. Eyebrows on fleek means her eyebrows looked fantastic. They were on point, perfect. Roll out. Yes, 2 words. And I have to do this in the air. I'm sorry. This is my secret shame as a lexicographer. I can't actually spell aloud. Okay, so on is O-N space F-L-E-E-K. Now you all know my shameful secret. So on fleek, she used it, and it sort of just took off. Within 6 months, 10% of all Google searches worldwide were for on fleek meaning. More people searched for on fleek meaning than searched for the words Syria or refugee crisis. But now on fleek has disappeared. Like, very few people say on fleek. It's gone back to being something that is sort of more slang. So, but the internet made that possible. I mean, the internet made Peaches Monroe an international star. So that's what the internet's doing. It's giving us more, which is overwhelming, but it's also giving us it's giving us access to a different type of English, which is exciting.
I have a question about technology in the intersection of dictionaries. Mm-hmm. So I have kids, they're 10 and 12, and I find that they never go to a dictionary. They just take whatever spell check gives them. And I was curious if there's some sort of relationship with like Microsoft or Apple that a lexicographer or dictionary has to influence what comes up in those spell checks or how they come up, or if they
if only.
Or if there's been any sort of discussion in the lexicographer community about that.
I mean, there has, but I mean, our company has tried to approach both Microsoft and Apple. Here's the thing. Microsoft and Apple are really, 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 really big companies. And even though Merriam-Webster has a big name, it's a really, 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 really small company. And it's actually cheaper for most of those places to either use a free word list, of which there are lots on the internet, or they will say, well, we'll license this word list from you once, but we just want the words. We're not going to take the definitions, or we're going to take the word list from this dictionary and the definitions from this dictionary, and we're going to smash them together, which also happens. So, yeah, I mean, we used to actually, a long time ago now, in the late 90s, Merriam-Webster had its own spell checker CD-ROM. This was one of the first CD-ROMs we did. It was very fancy. And no one used it because everyone used what was then WordPerfect 5 or Microsoft Word 1995, I guess. So yeah, there's not, I mean, that intersection doesn't exist inside of Microsoft Word or within Apple. I mean, I think dictionary makers would love to be able to move into places like that, but we don't get to make that decision. That's all Microsoft and Apple.
I would like to ask if there are certain additions or new words or new ways of using words that are making you sad. I guess you could ask as well if there's if there are new words that are emerging that make you happy that they're being included. The phrase that comes to my mind that I hear all the time that gives me consternation is, "I'm good."
Oh, I'm good, like as in no thanks, I don't need that, I'm all set, I'm fulfilled, I'm okay. I actually, so I know this lovely gentleman, his name is Dan. Dan, I actually think that goes back to like 1500, I'm sorry. Yeah, that sounds like, doesn't it sound about 16th century? Yeah, I think satisfied, good meaning satisfied, goes back to the 16th century. This is another weird occupational hazard. Like I can go, that sounds about 13th century to me. I'm sorry, I may be wrong, but I seem to think that it's a pretty old use. New uses that make me sad. Well, I talked about pleasure. That's a new use. The thing that's hard is that whenever we find something that we think is new, it actually ends up being a lot older than we think. About a year ago, I was going through a newspaper archive for some reason, and I don't remember what it was. And I ran across the word staycation, which we entered, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago. And it was one of those words that everyone, we publicized it because it sounds new and hip and everything, and everyone went, it's a stupid word. No one needs the word staycation. Staycation, for those of you who don't know, is when you take a vacation and you stay at home. It was very popular after the recession. Imagine that. And we had dated it, I think, we had found its first written use in something like 2005 or 2003, and I found a written use of it in a beer ad from 1944. So that changes the way that we think of these words, right? Like, so staycation, lots of think pieces were written about staycation when we included it, because that's what we do now, we write think pieces, so long form about the stupidity of staycation. And a lot of people a lot of people like to tie these new words to major cultural movements. So people are saying, staycation, this is this, sort of yuppie thing. People can't live with austerity. People can't live within the Great Recession. They need something to make them feel better. They can't go to Cabo anymore, so now they're going to stay at home and I don't know, play Settlers of Catan, or, And so you got all these think pieces about how staycation was very much this sort of modern yuppie phenomenon. Well, in the beer ad, I love that it was in a beer ad, that I found it in, a staycation was actually a patriotic thing that you did, like having a victory garden. Like, you give up something for your troops. You have a staycation with, I don't know, Feldhauser beer, or whatever beer it was. So lots of the words that we think are new are actually really old, and I think that changes the way that you view them. OMG, everyone hates OMG, right? OMG and LOL, these are killing the English language. OMG was first used in a letter from John Arbuthnot, who was the senior admiral, to Winston Churchill in 1917. And we know that it's OMG, meaning, oh my God, because he handily glossed it for us. He said he was talking about some perk that was going to be given to the lower ranks of the British Navy after, as the war was winding down. And he said, OMG, oh my God, shower it upon the Admiralty. So we know that that's the OMG he was using, not some in-house Navy thing. So, if OMG, so that has to change all these think pieces, that texting, so what are we going to say, typewriters are the reason that English is dying? So I actually try not to dwell too much on things that make me sad, because I think English is great. I mean, lots of people nay-bray the end of English, and they stand on their rooftops and say English is falling all to hell, and that's just objectively not true. More people have speak English now than have ever spoken English in history. It's a global language. It's the lingua franca. I'm happy when people are, making up weird words, because it keeps me in a job. So.
Thank you. Can I pitch you 2 questions and you pick whichever you feels better, easier to answer?
Okay.
Okay. Because they're rather vague, and I'm not sure if they're answerable. But the first one was, you said about on fleek, and my colleague here pointed to me and said that he says it sometimes, which brings up a trend in particular internet culture, where things are said ironically, and we could debate the meaning of ironically and so on and so forth. But it seems like every now and then a word will be returned to or exhumed and used with a kind of tongue-in-cheek. And I wonder what you think about that in kind of modern usage in terms of just, not really slang, but informal vernacular. The other one is, whichever you feel you want to answer, is just more of general, especially now with like clickbait articles, there's always something like, 10 German words or Japanese words that express something that English
I've written
can't.
some of those articles.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, so this might be easier to answer. I don't know. I was wondering if there's any words you wish were in English or had an English equivalent, or that you feel like English could, you wish you had an expression that English could express better? I don't know.
Oh yeah, I'm answering that one because that's a fun one to end with. So I fart around in German. I'll say that. I don't speak it anymore. I used to speak it fluently, and now I don't speak it. There are 2 German words that I adore that I wish that we had in English. One is Kummerspeck, which refers to sort of the fat that you have when you overeat. Like, you know, this is Kummerspeck. I have Kummerspeck. Ich habe Kummerspeck. But Kummerspeck literally translates to grief bacon. So it's this idea that you're sad about all of the lard on you. So I think that's a great one. And then my favorite German word is the German word, we call it a tramp stamp, which is a lower back tattoo. And in German, they call that an Arschgeweih, which literally translates to ass antlers. And I think that's much better. And I feel like that's a great place to end the questions, actually. Thank you guys so much.